1. Introduction. The mysterious beginning. The town of Greybrook sat nestled in the shadow of a vast, dark forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, the kind of scent that lingered long after a storm had passed. The town itself was small, almost forgotten, with narrow cobbled streets lined by crooked houses and shop windows that were never quite clean. It wasn't the kind of place you visited willingly, but one you might find yourself passing through on a lonely, foggy afternoon. Lena Ashford had lived there all her life. A librarian by trade, she spent most of her days cataloguing books and sipping lukewarm tea, her routine as unremarkable as the town itself. But lately, things had begun to change. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a storm cloud hovering just beyond the horizon. The locals had begun whispering again, a habit that had mostly been forgotten since the town's younger days. The whispers spoke of the forest, an ancient stretch of wilderness that had always been off limits. No one really knew what lurked there, but legend said it was a place of great power, one that could twist fate itself. Lena hadn't given much thought to these stories, dismissing them as local superstition. But one cold evening, as she locked up the library for the night, something happened that made her pause. A book, an old leather-bound journal, fell from one of the top shelves. Lena bent down to pick it up, but when she touched it, a sharp chill ran through her fingertips, a sensation she couldn't explain. The journal was covered in dust, but it felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for her, calling to her in some strange way. She opened the first page and read the words scrawled inside. The forest knows. It watches. The unease Lena had been feeling since the whispers began turned to something more. This wasn't a simple case of local folklore. Something was happening, something far more dangerous than she could imagine. And it had started with that strange book. 2. The call to action. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was just the beginning. The town's strange atmosphere, the whispers growing louder, and now the book. All of it was tied to something greater, something she couldn't ignore. The question was, what was she supposed to do about it? The next morning, she found herself at the town's only cafe, staring at the strange symbol etched into the journal's cover, her coffee long forgotten. She had been going over the pages all night, but the words only made her more confused. The more she read, the more she felt the pull of the forest, a force she couldn't explain. It wasn't long before someone noticed her distraction. Henry Gray, the town's unofficial historian, had lived in Greybrook longer than anyone else. He leaned over the table, peering down at the journal. His face hardened when he saw the symbol. "You've found it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost reverent. Lena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen Henry so shaken. "What is it? What does it mean?" He hesitated, glancing around the room as if ensuring no one was listening. "The journal belongs to someone who ventured too deep into the forest. No one returns from there, unless they're changed. Something is coming, Lena. The forest. It's awake." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "But why me? Why now?" "Because," Henry said, his eyes dark with fear, "the forest is calling for you. You've been marked." Lena felt the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. She wanted to run, to dismiss it all as paranoia. But deep down, she knew that the mystery of the journal, the whispers, and the ever-growing feeling of being watched were all connected. The forest was no longer just a story. It was real, and it had chosen her. The decision weighed on her. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to leave it all behind. But another part of her, one she didn't fully understand, felt compelled to answer the call. "Will you go?" Henry asked, his voice softer now. Lena took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the edge of the journal. It was an answer she had already known, even before she asked it. She couldn't walk away from this. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll go." And with that, her journey into the unknown began. Exploring the unknown. The path leading into the forest was little more than a faint trail, barely visible beneath the thick underbrush. It wound through the trees, disappearing into the shadows of the ancient woods, as though the forest itself was trying to hide it. Lena hesitated at the edge of the trees, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. The whispers she had heard from the townsfolk seemed to follow her here, floating just at the edge of her consciousness, warning her, urging her to turn back. But Lena couldn't turn back now. With a deep breath, she stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed into the forest's boundary, a strange stillness overtook the air. The birds stopped singing. The wind ceased to stir the leaves. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the damp earth beneath her feet. It felt as if the forest had swallowed all sound, all life, leaving her utterly alone. For the first time since she had set out, doubt crept in. Was this a mistake? Had she misjudged the danger? But just as quickly as the thought surfaced, a low rustling noise behind her shattered the silence. Lena spun around, her heart racing. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and cloaked in tattered black robes, their face hidden beneath her hood. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they tilted their head, as though studying her. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, the figure spoke, their voice a low rasp. "Not many dare to enter these woods," they said. "But you carry the mark." Lena's pulse quickened. The mark. She had been trying to ignore the implications of Henry's words, but now, standing in front of this mysterious figure, the reality of it hit her hard. She didn't know what it meant, but she could feel it deep in her bones. The truth was out there, and she had to find it. "Who are you?" she asked again, more firmly this time. The figure took a slow step forward, raising a gloved hand to pull back the hood, revealing an older woman, her face lined with age and wisdom. Her eyes, however, were unsettling, pale and clouded, as though she were not entirely human. "I am called Isolde," the woman said. "I guard the boundaries of the forest." Lena tried to process this. "What do you mean, guard?" Isolde's gaze darkened and her voice dropped to a whisper. "The forest is not what it seems. It watches, it listens, it waits. For centuries, it has drawn people like you, the marked ones. You have come because you're tied to something ancient, something that cannot be ignored." A chill ran down Lena's spine. "I don't understand." "You will?" Isolde said, her smile faint but knowing. "But first, you must understand this. Not all who enter these woods return unchanged, and some do not return at all." The cryptic warning hung in the air as Isolde stepped aside, allowing Lena to continue down the path. Without another word, the woman vanished back into the shadows, leaving Lena alone once more with the eerie silence of the forest. The deeper she ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees grew taller and closer together, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The air grew thicker, as though something unseen was pressing in on her from all sides. Lena felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, the sensation of being watched never far from her mind. And then she saw it. Nestled in a clearing ahead, partially hidden by thick vines, was an old stone ruin, a broken circle of ancient stones, weathered by time and neglect. The ground was overgrown with moss, and the air seemed heavy with the scent of decay. A strange, almost magnetic pull tugged at Lena, urging her toward the ruins. The journal she had found seemed to hum in her hands, its pages alive with an energy that she couldn't explain. She stepped closer, every instinct screaming for her to turn around, to leave. But something kept her moving forward. As she reached the center of the ruin, she felt it. A sudden intense wave of cold, as if the very ground beneath her was frozen. Her breath misted in the air, and the trees surrounding the clearing seemed to lean in, as though listening for something. Lena crouched down to examine the ground, her fingers brushing against the stones. They were carved with symbols, some familiar, others entirely foreign. The marks looked almost like a language, ancient, yet alive with a strange energy. And then she saw it. Beneath the vines, half buried in the earth, was something else. A gleaming shard of metal. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface, and instantly, a jolt of electricity shot through her body, sending her stumbling backward. The shard pulsed with a strange energy, and the air seemed to vibrate around her. She stood there, trembling, unsure whether she had just uncovered something powerful or something terrifying. As the world seemed to shift around her, Lena realized one thing. The forest wasn't just calling to her, it was waiting, watching, and had just begun to reveal its secrets. The first setback. Lena's heart raced as she stumbled away from the ruin, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shard she had uncovered still thrummed with unnatural energy, and the chill that had overtaken her body refused to dissipate. Her thoughts whirled, but nothing made sense. What had I just touched? She was no closer to understanding the truth, and the further she walked into the forest, the more oppressive it felt. The silence was suffocating, as though the very woods were closing in around her. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and she froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. It wasn't an earthquake, just a subtle shift, as though something immense was moving under the earth, deep in the forest's heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone. Something was watching her. The forest? No, it felt different, more malicious. Something else. Lena turned to glance back at the ruin. The strange glowing shard still pulsed in her hand, and her stomach churned with an unsettling mix of fear and curiosity. Was this what Isolde meant by the forest waiting? But before she could take another step, a sudden rustling in the trees caught her attention. The sound was too loud, too fast, as though something was moving through the undergrowth with terrifying speed. Lena spun, her body instinctively tensing. Then from the shadows between the trees, figures appeared. 2 men, their faces obscured by the dim light, their movements strangely synchronized, as if they were part of some larger, unseen force. They didn't speak, just watched her with piercing, unblinking eyes. A chill gripped Lena's heart, and she instinctively stepped back, clutching the shard tighter. But the men didn't approach. They simply stood there, as if waiting for something. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "What do you want?" One of the men spoke, his voice low and smooth. "You shouldn't have come here." Lena's mind raced. How did they know? The other man stepped forward, his movements unnervingly fluid, and Lena instinctively took another step back. "The forest was never meant for you. There's no going back now." Something in his tone sent a wave of cold dread through her. It wasn't just that they knew about her, about the journal and the mark. It was the certainty in their voices, the way they spoke as though she had already sealed her fate by stepping into the woods. "No," Lena whispered, more to herself than to them. "I have to finish this. I need to understand what's happening." "You will understand," the first man said, his voice turning colder, sharper. "But not how you think." Before Lena could ask what he meant, the ground trembled again, this time more violently. She stumbled, her legs buckling beneath her as the earth cracked open, splitting wide in a deep, jagged wound that ran beneath her feet. She fell to the ground, her hands scraping against the earth, and the shard slipped from her fingers, tumbling into the crevice. "No!" Lena gasped, scrambling to her feet, but it was too late. The earth closed up, swallowing the shard whole. She stared in horror, unable to move. The men stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had come. The forest, once eerily quiet, now seemed to hum with something dark, something angry. Lena stood frozen, fear creeping in, her mind racing. She couldn't understand what had just happened. Why had they appeared? Why had they taken the shard? Was this a warning? Her thoughts spiraled, and then an overwhelming sense of isolation washed over her. She was alone in the forest, completely alone. No one knew where I was. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, and she had no way of knowing which path to take. She had no guidance, no help, only the cryptic warnings of Isolde and the eerie men who had just vanished. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she sank to the ground, her head in her hands. She had come here searching for answers, but now she felt more lost than ever. The forest had turned against her, and whatever she had uncovered, whatever force was stirring beneath the earth, it were far more dangerous than she had imagined. Tears welled up in her eyes, frustration mixing with the terror clawing at her chest. She had failed. She had made a mistake. Maybe this wasn't something she was meant to understand. Maybe the forest was a force too ancient, too powerful for someone like her to confront. But even as doubt whispered in her mind, a small, persistent voice in the back of her head refused to let go. "You're not done yet. You can't quit now." Lena wiped her tears away, her resolve hardening. She had lost the shard, but she hadn't lost the will to uncover the truth. Something in her stirred, a fire, deep within. She would find another way. She would push forward, because now more than ever she understood the stakes. The forest was alive, and it was not done with her yet. 5. Uncovering the truth. The days blurred into one another as Lena wandered deeper into the forest. The sharpness of her initial fear had dulled into a kind of numbness, though the unease still gnawed at her. She had lost the shard, yes, but the forest was still holding on to her. pulling her forward. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something just beyond the edge of her understanding, waiting for her to uncover it. But the path wasn't easy. Every step seemed to bring more confusion, more questions, more questions. The forest grew thicker, denser, as if it were resisting her progress. Strange noises, unseen creatures rustling just beyond her line of sight, echoed through the trees, sending shivers down her spine. The air was heavier, thicker with something unseen, something that pressed against her like a looming storm. She hadn't seen another soul since the cryptic men had vanished into the shadows, and though she had tried to retrace her steps, nothing seemed familiar anymore. Then, on the third day of her journey, she came across something unexpected. A small cabin stood in the heart of a secluded grove, its wooden walls weathered by time, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of moss and ivy. It was an eerie, isolated structure, far removed from the usual paths that had brought her this far. Lena approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Could this be the home of someone who had come before her? Someone who might hold the answers she desperately needed? She hesitated at the door, hand resting on the old brass handle. A low, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from within the cabin, like a heartbeat echoing through the very air. Taking a deep breath, Lena pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single lantern in the corner. Dust covered every surface, the furniture left in a state of abandonment, as though the occupant had disappeared without a trace. But it was what lay on the table that caught Lena's attention. A stack of yellowed papers, old maps, journals, and notes scattered across the wood. Her fingers trembled as she picked up one of the journals, its pages fragile with age, the handwriting cramped and urgent. She began to read. The journal detailed someone's descent into the forest, their search for something powerful, something ancient. The words were disjointed, almost frantic at times, but one thing stood out. The heart of the forest. It was spoken of in cryptic terms, a force that could bend time itself, alter fate, and shape reality in ways that no human should control. Lena's breath hitched as she read further. The writer spoke of a ritual, a dangerous ritual that could awaken the heart, but it required a sacrifice, a soul willing to merge with the forest, becoming part of its living essence. The journal hinted that those who sought it had been marked long before they stepped into the woods, marked by something ancient, something older than the forest itself. The mark, Lena thought, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest had chosen her. She had been marked. But as she read more, a creeping sense of dread settled over her. The writer had made it clear that the forest wasn't just an ancient being. It had its own will, its own hunger. It wanted something that was never meant to be controlled. The more Lena read, the clearer it became. This was no innocent search for answers. This was a dangerous game. The pages also spoke of others, people who had come before the writer, each one part of a larger pattern. They too had been marked and had sought the heart, only to be consumed by it. Some had vanished completely, others had returned changed, twisted into something else entirely. Lena closed the journal, the truth settling heavily in her gut. The forest wasn't just alive, it was a force of nature, a power that fed on those who sought it, those who tried to harness it. And it seemed she wasn't the first to be drawn in. How many others had come before her? How many had been swallowed whole by the heart? She took a step back from the table, her mind racing. This discovery, while a breakthrough, raised more questions than it answered. Was the writer telling the truth? Or had they been consumed by madness, their obsession with the forest clouding their judgment? And then there was the bigger question. What did the forest want with her? Was she truly marked? Or was this all part of something much larger? Something orchestrated by forces beyond her understanding? The thought made her stomach churn. Could there be hidden agendas at play? Was there someone, or something, guiding her steps, pushing her toward the heart for reasons she couldn't yet comprehend? A creaking noise from behind her snapped Lena out of her thoughts. She turned sharply, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The door to the cabin had creaked open, a figure standing in the threshold. Did you think you could hide from the truth forever? Isolde's voice was low, like a whisper carried on the wind. Her eyes gleamed with an unsettling knowing, her expression unreadable. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Isolde, what was she doing here? And how much did she know about the forest's true nature? Isolde, Lena's voice faltered, the weight of the journal's revelations crashing over her. What is this? What am I supposed to do now? Isolde stepped closer, her gaze piercing. The forest is not something to be understood. It is a living thing, with desires and rules that have existed long before humanity. You've uncovered part of the truth, but what you don't understand is that the heart, it chooses its vessel, and once chosen, there is no turning back. Lena's stomach twisted. Vessel? You mean me? Isolde's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. It was always meant to be you. 6. Rising conflict. Lena stood frozen, the weight of Isolde's words pressing down on her like a physical force. It was always meant to be you. The phrase echoed in her mind, repeating itself until it felt like the air itself was vibrating with a silent, oppressive warning. She stepped back, eyes scanning the dim interior of the cabin. Isolde had appeared so suddenly, as if she had been waiting just outside, lurking in the shadows, watching Lena's every move. It was unnerving. The more Lena thought about it, the more her sense of betrayal twisted in her chest. Isolde had known everything. She had known about the forest, about the heart, and about Lena's role in it from the very beginning. And yet, she hadn't warned her, hadn't told her the whole truth. Why didn't you tell me? Lena's voice was barely more than a whisper, her throat tight with emotion. What is this forest? Why am I here? Isolde's eyes darkened, and she crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps. Her presence filled the space, cold and unyielding. I didn't tell you because you had to understand it for yourself. You had to see the truth with your own eyes. The forest isn't something you can learn about secondhand, Lena. It must be experienced. Lena shook her head, frustration and fear rising in equal measure. That's not an answer. You've been playing me from the start. A sudden crash interrupted her words, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps coming from outside the cabin. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. They were here. The men from the forest, the ones who had taken the shard, had followed her. Isolde's gaze flickered toward the door, a look of recognition flashing across her face. They've come. Lena barely had time to react, before the door to the cabin burst open with a deafening bang. Two figures stepped inside, tall and imposing, their eyes locked on Lena with unblinking intensity. The men from before. But this time, their presence felt even more menacing. There was something darker about them, something hungry. Lena instinctively stepped back, heart hammering in her chest. She had no idea what they wanted now, but she knew this wasn't the same encounter as before. They were no longer simply watching her, they were hunting her. The man who had spoken before, the one with the pale, almost unnatural eyes, smirked as he stepped forward. "You've made things more complicated than they needed to be, Lena. The forest is not a game. You've chosen to fight it, but you'll find it much harder to win than you think." Isolde raised a hand, her voice cold and firm. "Enough. She has a right to make her own decisions." Lena turned to her, confusion and fear clouding her thoughts. What do they want? What are they going to do to me? The man with the pale eyes laughed, the sound too sharp and cruel. "Oh, they won't do anything. Not yet. But the forest, it has its own way of dealing with things." Lena's breath caught in her throat. A shadow moved behind the men, something enormous, dark, and shifting. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized that the forest itself was responding to them. It was alive, aware, and it was closing in on her. "You've made a choice, Lena," the second man said, his voice low and menacing. "Now you must face the consequences." Lena's heart raced, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of her isolation. The forest had been watching her, pulling her deeper with each step. But it wasn't just the forest that was after her now. These men, whatever they were part of something much bigger, something darker, and they weren't going to let her walk away. They were here to stop her, to keep her from discovering the full truth. "Isolde," Lena gasped, turning toward the woman who had guided her this far. "What is this? What do they want from me?" Isolde's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "They want the heart, Lena. They've always wanted it, and they will do anything to stop you from reaching it." Lena's mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. The heart was more than just a legend. It was a powerful force, one that could be controlled, if the right person was chosen. And now, the men, these shadowed figures who seemed to be part of the forest itself, would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. She could feel the weight of her decision, the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. The stakes had never been higher. She wasn't just a pawn in a game anymore. She was the game. The heart of the forest, the mysterious force that everyone wanted, was within her reach. But with it came danger, betrayal, and the stark realization that the deeper she went, the more she would lose. The tension in the air thickened as the men stepped closer, and Lena knew without a doubt that her journey was no longer just about discovery. It was about survival. She could feel the forest pressing in on her from all sides, and the dangers weren't just in the shadows anymore. They were right in front of her. And there was no turning back. 7. The unexpected ally. Lena's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears as the men from the forest closed in on her. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to escape. But the forest was a prison now, the very air thick with malevolent energy. She wasn't sure if she could outrun the danger, and she certainly didn't know where to go. As the men advanced, their expressions cold and unyielding, a soft rustling sound came from the trees behind them. Lena whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. From the shadow of the dense foliage, a figure emerged, a tall woman draped in dark, tattered cloaks. She moved with unnatural grace, as though she were part of the forest itself, blending with the shadows and the light. The new arrival's gaze was sharp, assessing. Her eyes locked on Lena, and for a moment it felt as though the entire world paused. "You don't belong here," the woman said, her voice low but commanding. "But neither do they." The men stopped in their tracks, a flicker of confusion passing between them. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, his voice laced with authority. The woman didn't answer immediately. She merely glanced at Lena, her lips curling into a faint, enigmatic smile. Someone who is tired of watching this madness. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Who was this person? Her instinct screamed at her not to trust her, but the woman's presence was a strange balm to the fear tightening around her chest. "What do you want?" Lena asked, voice shaking but defiant. "I'm offering you an opportunity," the woman replied. "A chance to turn the tide." Lena glanced back at the men, their eyes narrowing as they took slow, deliberate steps forward. She could feel the tension in the air like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. The woman stood firm, her eyes never leaving the men. "But I don't trust you," Lena said, though she couldn't deny the flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Was this a lifeline, or another trap? The woman raised an eyebrow. "You shouldn't trust me, but your only other option is to stand here and let them finish what they started." The men hissed, sensing the shift in power. "You can't protect her forever." One of them sneered. Lena's thoughts raced, torn between the woman's offer and her instinct to trust no one. But as the shadows around her seemed to shift, the oppressive weight of the forest closing in, she realized that the unknown ally was her only chance. For now, she had no choice but to accept the offer. "I'll go with you," Lena said, her voice steeling with resolve. "But I'm watching you." The woman's smile deepened. Wise. The tension still hung thick in the air, but the men stepped back, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to challenge the mysterious woman. With one last warning glance, they melted back into the forest, their figures vanishing as if they had never been there at all. Lena took a shaky breath, her heart still hammering in her chest, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. Wait. The descent into danger. Lena and her mysterious ally moved deeper into the forest, the shadows growing thicker as they advanced. The woman, who had introduced herself simply as Asha, led the way with a quiet confidence, moving swiftly through the underbrush as if she were part of the very landscape. Lena struggled to keep up, the unfamiliar terrain making her feel more and more isolated with each passing step. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, the trees twisting in unnatural shapes as if they were alive and watching. The silence was deafening, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in on her, suffocating her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the men, or something worse, lurking just beyond the trees. "Asha!" Lena called out after a few moments of silence. "Where are we going?" Asha didn't look back, but spoke in a low, steady voice. to the heart of it all, where the forest's will is strongest. Lena's stomach tightened. And what does that mean? What are you really after? The woman's eyes flashed briefly with something unreadable, but she remained silent, leading Lena further into the woods. With every step, Lena felt more unsettled. Asher's silence was unnerving, but it was the forest itself that seemed to grow more restless, the air thick with an unseen force, as though the very ground beneath her feet was aware of her presence. They reached a clearing eventually, the moonlight filtering through the canopy above, casting strange, elongated shadows. In the centre of the clearing, an enormous tree stood, its gnarled roots twisting upward like skeletal fingers, its trunk wide and ancient. The tree seemed to pulse with a strange energy, its bark dark and gleaming, as if alive. Lena felt a pull toward it, a deep magnetic force tugging at her chest. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. "This is it," Asher said, her voice almost a whisper. Lena stopped in her tracks, suddenly unsure. "What is it?" "The source," Asher replied. "The heart." Lena felt a cold shiver of realization slide down her spine. She had heard the stories, but seeing the heart in person was something entirely different. It was no longer just a concept, it was real. And it was more powerful, more dangerous than she had imagined. A sharp crack split the air, and Lena spun around to see the men from before emerging from the shadows. They were not alone. Behind them, towering figures made of twisted vines and dark energy surged forward, their limbs moving with an unnatural fluidity. "You thought you could escape us?" one of the men sneered. "You thought you could control the heart?" The air seemed to shift, the forest around them darkening, as if it were preparing for a fight. The ground trembled, and Lena could feel the heart's power thrumming through her, an overwhelming force she could barely comprehend. Asher stepped in front of her, blocking her from the advancing figures. "You've come too far, but it's not too late to turn back," Asher warned, her voice laced with tension. Lena glanced at the heart, feeling its weight in her chest. The forest was no longer just a mystery. It was a battlefield, and she was right in the center of it. The men moved closer, and Lena's heart raced. The stakes had never been higher. In that moment, she realized the truth. This was not just a quest for answers. It was a fight for survival. And she was standing on the edge of it. 9. The climax. The final confrontation. Vena's heart pounded in her chest as the men advanced, their figures now surrounded by creatures made of dark vines and shifting shadows. The forest itself seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the energy of the heart. The enormous tree pulsed before her, its roots crawling like serpents across the ground, eager to grasp anything that came too close. Asher stood in front of Lena, her expression cold, unwavering. She raised a hand, the flickering light of the clearing casting eerie shadows on her face. "You're too late," she said to the men, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable threat. "The heart has chosen. You can't change that." The men, however, were undeterred. The pale-eyed one, now at the forefront, took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Lena with cold precision. "You think you can control it, girl? The forest has only one master, and it isn't you." Lena's eyes darted between Asher and the men. The air crackled with tension, the energy from the heart building around her, pushing against her very bones. She had come this far, learned so much, but now standing here with everything on the line, the truth hit her with full force. She had been chosen, not just by the forest, but by the very nature of the heart. It was more than an artifact. It was a force, alive and ancient, a power beyond human comprehension. Could she control it? Or would it consume her like it had consumed so many others before? "We don't have time for games," the man with the pale eyes sneered. "Give up. The forest is ours." Lena's pulse thundered in her ears, but she stood her ground. Every instinct told her to run, to turn back, but the decision had already been made. She was the vessel, the one who could unlock the heart's power. If she backed down now, everything she'd learned, everything she'd fought for, would have been for nothing. Usher's eyes flashed to Lena, a silent plea. "Trust me," she said quietly, "and together we can control it." But in that moment, Lena realized something. Asha was not the ally she had once believed her to be. She was as much a part of the forest scheme as the men. She wanted the heart's power for herself, just as much as they did. Lena took a deep breath, her body trembling with the weight of the decision before her. She was standing at the threshold of something immense, something that could destroy her if she wasn't careful. The forest had its own will. Its hunger was infinite. But it was also her choice now, whether to accept the forest's pull and embrace its power, or to reject it entirely. The choice was clear. "I won't let you take it," Lena declared, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't be your pawn." Without warning, she turned to the heart, stepping forward, her eyes locked onto its beating, pulsing core. As she approached, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the tree's roots stretching toward her like hungry fingers. The men lunged, but the forest responded, pushing them back with an unseen force. The very air seemed to rip apart as the heart's power surged through Lena's veins. It was unlike anything she'd ever felt before. The energy coursed through her like lightning, hot and suffocating. Her skin burned, her vision blurred, and yet she felt a deep connection to the forest. She could feel its desires, its endless hunger for control. She could feel the immense weight of the heart's power, and in that moment, Lena understood. She understood its purpose, its true nature. The heart was not just a force of creation, it was a force of destruction, a force that consumed everything it touched. But it could also be guided. With a cry of determination, Lena focused every ounce of willpower she had. She could choose what the heart would become. The energy surged within her, threatening to consume her, but she refused to let it. The forest, the heart, it all bent to her will. For a split second, everything was still. Then, with a violent pulse of power, the forest erupted. The men screamed as the very ground swallowed them whole, their forms consumed by the roots of the tree. Asha, too, was pulled into the darkness, her face twisted in shock as she vanished. Lena collapsed to her knees, the power fading as the heart returned to its dormant state. The forest fell silent. 10. The resolution and aftermath. The forest was still. Lena lay on the cold ground, breathing heavily, her body aching as though she had been torn apart and remade. She had done it. She had wielded the heart's power, forced it to bend to her will. The men were gone, Asha was gone, and the forest had returned to a strange quiet. But in the silence, Lena could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She had won, yes. But at what cost? The heart pulsed softly, a constant reminder of the power she had embraced. She could feel it within her, a force that would always be a part of her. The question lingered. Had she truly controlled it, or had it merely used her to fulfill its will? Lena slowly pushed herself to her feet, glancing around the clearing. The world was eerily calm, but the unease inside her remained. The heart was still there, pulsing in the distance, a dark and powerful force she could no longer ignore. It was her responsibility now, a weight she had to carry. As she turned and began walking away, the forest seemed to part for her, as if recognizing its new keeper. But even as Lena moved through the trees, there was something in her heart that unsettled her. The mystery of the heart wasn't over. The consequences of her decision were just beginning to unfold, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest's true nature was far more complex than she could ever understand. One thing was clear. The journey was far from over, and the heart was only the beginning.